Why is there a kid in the cockpit? They mocked the black girl. But she turned out to be. Flight 247 cruised through the afternoon sky at 35,000 feet, its passengers settling into the familiar rhythm of a cross-country journey. The hum of engines mixed with quiet conversations and the occasional ding of the seatbelt sign. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until a 12-year-old girl appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Is that a kid?" whispered Margaret Chen from seat 12A, nudging her husband with sharp urgency. The girl stood there like she belonged, her small frame silhouetted against the bright instrument panels behind her. She wore a crisp white button-down shirt and navy pants, her hair pulled back in two neat braids. In her hands she clutched what looked like an old leather journal, worn and weathered around the edges. Captain Hayes emerged from the cockpit behind her, his silver hair catching the cabin light as he placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Just for a moment, Amara," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the first few rows to hear. "Amara?" The name rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. "Did he just call her by name?" guessed Brad Morrison, a stocky man in a business suit who'd been complaining about everything from the peanuts to the air temperature since takeoff. "What kind of airline lets random kids wander into the cockpit?" The murmurs started small, curious whispers between spouses, raised eyebrows from business travelers. But as words spread row by row, the whispers grew louder, sharper, more cutting. "Probably some rich kid whose daddy bought her a tour," snickered Jessica Palmer, a blonde woman in designer clothes. She pulled out her phone, angling for a photo. "Wait till I post this on social media. Skyrise Airlines, now with child pilots." Laughter erupted from the seats around her, cruel and dismissive. "Maybe she's here for Bring Your Daughter to Work Day," chuckled another passenger. "Though I didn't know babysitting counted as pilot training." Amara's shoulders stiffened at the comment, but she kept her chin up, her dark eyes focused straight ahead. The leather journal in her hands trembled slightly, the only sign that the words were hitting their mark. Flight attendant Susan Rodriguez approached the crowd of gawking passengers, her professional smile strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The captain will address any concerns." "Concerns?" Brad Morrison stood up despite the seatbelt sign, his voice booming across the cabin. "You bet I have concerns. I paid good money for this flight, not to be part of some kid's field trip to the cockpit." A chorus of agreement rose from nearby passengers. Cell phones appeared, camera flashes going off as people tried to capture what they saw as the absurdity of the moment. "This is exactly what's wrong with airlines today," declared Martha Stevens, a stern-faced woman in her 60s. "Letting political correctness put children in dangerous situations just to make some point." "What point would that be?" asked Dr. James Washington, a black professor sitting 3 rows back. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made several passengers turn around. Martha's face reddened. "You know what I mean. They're probably pushing some diversity agenda, putting that girl up there for the cameras." The word girl came out like an accusation, loaded with implications that made Dr. Washington's jaw tighten. "She doesn't even look old enough to drive a car, let alone be in an airplane cockpit," added another voice from the middle section. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the cockpit and the cabin full of hostile stares. Every comment felt like a slap, every whispered joke like a knife to her confidence. These people saw her as nothing more than a child playing dress-up, a diversity stunt, a mistake waiting to happen. But she thought of her grandfather's words, spoken to her just last week. "Amara, baby, the sky doesn't care about the color of your skin or how old you are. It only cares about how well you can fly." Captain Hayes noticed the commotion and stepped forward, his authoritative presence commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your curiosity about our young guest here. But I assure you, everything is completely under control and within regulations." "Regulations?" Brad Morrison's voice pitched higher. "What regulations allow children in the cockpit during flight? This is insane." "I want to speak to someone in charge," demanded Jessica Palmer, waving her phone. "This is going straight to social media and the FAA. A 12-year-old in the cockpit? Are you people crazy? Flight attendant Rodriguez stepped in again, her training kicking in as she tried to de-escalate. Sir, ma'am, please remain calm. The captain has full authority over. Full authority to endanger passengers? Margaret Chen stood up now too, her voice shrill. I don't care whose kid she is, she doesn't belong up there. The mockery continued, growing more intense with each passing moment. Passengers pulled out their phones, typing furiously, sharing photos and videos with captions like, "Child pilot on my flight," and, "Is this real life?" Through it all, Amara remained standing in that doorway, clutching her grandfather's old logbook, the same logbook he'd carried when he first learned to fly, when he was building the very airline these passengers were now criticizing. She felt the weight of every stare, every whispered insult, every flash of a camera phone. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that the child they were mocking had more right to be in that cockpit than any of them realized. The turbulence was about to begin, and it wouldn't just be from the weather outside. 5 years earlier, 7-year-old Amara Johnson pressed her face against the glass wall of the flight simulator room, watching her grandfather's weathered hands move across controls that looked like magic to her young eyes. Charles Johnson, Papa Charlie, as she called him, sat in the captain's seat of the Boeing 737 simulator, his deep voice calm and steady as he guided an imaginary plane through a thunderstorm. "Papa Charlie, can I try?" Amara whispered, though they were the only ones in the private training facility at 6 a.m. Charles smiled, the same gentle smile that had charmed investors 30 years ago when he pitched his dream of an airline built on dignity and excellence. Back then, he'd been just Charlie Johnson, the janitor who mopped floors at Hartwell Aviation while studying pilot manuals by flashlight in broom closets. "Come here, little bird," he said, patting his knee. "But remember our rule. This is our secret," Amara recited dutifully as she climbed onto his lap. "Until I'm ready to fly for real." Charles had built Skyrise Airlines from nothing, starting with one leased plane and a dream that a black man could run an airline as well as anyone. He'd faced mockery then too, investors who laughed at the janitor with big ideas. But he'd proven them all wrong, building Skyrise into one of the most respected regional carriers in the country. Now, at 72, he was preparing his heir. Not his son, who'd chosen medicine over aviation. Not his nephews, who showed no interest in the family business. But his granddaughter, the quiet, serious little girl who asked about wind patterns instead of dolls, who could calculate fuel consumption faster than some of his pilots. "Feel the yoke," Charles instructed, placing Amara's small hands on the controls. "The plane talks to you through your hands. Listen to what she's saying." Amara closed her eyes, concentrating. Even in the simulator, she could sense the imaginary aircraft's attitude, its response to her gentle inputs. It was like a conversation in a language she was born to understand. This had been their routine for months now, secret morning sessions before the regular training staff arrived. Charles was teaching her everything: basic aerodynamics, navigation, weather patterns, emergency procedures. Most 7-year-olds were learning to ride bikes. Amara was learning to fly planes. "Your mama would be so proud," Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The mention of her mother always made Amara's chest tighten. Captain Elena Johnson had been Skyrise's youngest pilot, a trailblazer who'd proven that women could handle the skies just as well as men. She'd died 3 years ago when her small charter plane was caught in a sudden storm over the Rockies. Mechanical failure, the investigators said. Bad weather. Just one of those tragic accidents that sometimes claimed even the best pilots. But Amara remembered her mother's final phone call, static-filled and urgent. "Tell Papa Charlie the storm patterns were wrong, baby. The weather reports were all wrong." That's when Amara decided she would learn everything her mother knew, and more. She would understand storms better than any pilot alive. She would never be caught off guard like her mama had been. "I want to practice the emergency descent again," Amara said, her voice steadier than most adults faced with the same scenario. Charles studied his granddaughter's face, so young, yet carrying a determination that reminded him of himself at that age, cleaning hangars and dreaming of the sky. "You sure, little bird? That's advanced stuff. Mama always said emergencies don't wait for you to be ready." For the next hour, Charles put Amara through scenarios that would challenge seasoned pilots. Engine failures at altitude. Sudden loss of hydraulics. Electrical malfunctions in bad weather. Each time, she approached the problems methodically, her small fingers dancing across controls while she narrated her decisions. "Airspeed, altitude, attitude," she chanted, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "The 3 A's that keep you alive." By age 10, Amara was spending every weekend and school holiday at the Skyrise Training Center. The staff knew her as Charlie's granddaughter, the quiet kid who read flight manuals like fairy tales and could spot maintenance issues that grown men missed. What they didn't know was that she'd been logging simulator hours that would rival many commercial pilot candidates. Charles kept detailed records of her progress, sealed files in his private office that documented every lesson, every milestone, every indication that his granddaughter possessed not just the technical skills but the judgment and composure necessary for command. At 11, she memorized every page of Charles's personal logbook, the same leather journal she now carried, filled with decades of flight entries, weather observations, and hard-won wisdom. She could recite his most challenging flights from memory, understanding not just what happened but why each decision was made. The Skyrise board knew, of course. Charles had been preparing them quietly for years, sharing carefully edited videos of Amara's simulator sessions, her test scores, her uncanny ability to think like a pilot despite her age. They'd seen the documentation, the psychological evaluations, the proof that Charles Johnson's granddaughter wasn't just playing at being a pilot, she was genuinely gifted. "She's our future," Charles told the board members during a private meeting 6 months ago. "Not next year or the year after, but someday. And when that day comes, Skyrise will be in the hands of someone who understands that flying isn't just a job, it's a calling." Now, standing in that cockpit doorway at 12, facing the mockery of passengers who saw only her age and skin color, Amara carried the weight of that legacy. Every hour in the simulator, every lesson from Papa Charlie, every story about her mother's courage, it all led to this moment. The passengers thought they were looking at a child out of place. They had no idea they were looking at the future of Skyrise Airlines. Present day. The plane shuddered violently, jerking Amara back to the harsh reality of Flight 247. Coffee cups rattled in their holders, and several passengers grabbed their armrests as the Boeing 737 hit a pocket of rough air over the Colorado Rockies. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence," Captain Hayes announced over the intercom, his voice steady and reassuring. "Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." But the turbulence was more than light, and Amara could tell from the captain's subtle adjustments that he was working harder than he let on to keep the plane stable. She'd felt this kind of air disturbance in the simulator countless times, the kind that separated good pilots from great ones. "Amara," Captain Hayes said quietly, gesturing toward the jump seat behind the co-pilot's station. "Would you like to observe for a few minutes?" Quietly. The invitation was both an honor and a test. Hayes knew who she was, one of the few outside the board who'd been briefed on Charles Johnson's granddaughter and her unusual training. He'd flown with her grandfather for years and had personally witnessed some of Amara's simulator sessions. But sitting in the cockpit during actual turbulence was different from any simulation. As Amara moved toward the jump seat, her grandfather's worn logbook clutched against her chest, the complaints from the cabin erupted like a volcano. "Are you kidding me?" Brad Morrison's voice boomed from seat 8C. "You're actually letting her stay up there during turbulence? This isn't a game!" shouted Jessica Palmer, her phone already recording. "Get the kid out of there before someone gets hurt!" Margaret Chin stood up despite the rough air, pointing an accusatory finger toward the cockpit. "I'm calling my lawyer the minute we land! This is criminal negligence!" The seatbelt sign dinged insistently, but several passengers ignored it, standing and clustering in the aisles to voice their outrage. Flight attendant Susan Rodriguez struggled to maintain order as the plane continued to buck and roll. "Sir, please return to your seat immediately." she pleaded with a red-faced businessman who'd pushed his way to the front of the cabin. "Not until that child is removed from the cockpit," he declared. "I have a family. I'm not risking their lives for some publicity stunt." Dr. James Washington, still seated but watching the chaos unfold, shook his head in disgust. "You people are unbelievable," he muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "That girl is sitting quietly, not bothering anyone, and you're the ones creating a dangerous situation by standing up during turbulence. Don't lecture us." Martha Stevens snapped back. "This is about safety, not—" She paused, clearly wanting to say more but stopping herself just short of something uglier. "Not what?" Dr. Washington challenged, his voice sharp as steel. Captain Hayes emerged from the cockpit, his jaw set with determination. At 58 he dealt with every kind of passenger complaint imaginable, but this felt different. More personal. More cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his captain's voice cutting through the chaos, "I need everyone to return to your seats immediately. The young lady in the cockpit is there at my invitation and under my complete supervision. She poses no threat to this aircraft or your safety. Your invitation doesn't make it legal." Brad Morrison shouted back. "FAA regulations clearly state." "FAA regulations," Captain Hayes interrupted, "allow for authorized personnel to observe cockpit operations under specific circumstances. Miss Johnson is authorized." The use of Amara's last name sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Johnson? Like the airline's founder? But that couldn't be right. Could it? "I don't care if she's the president's daughter," Jessica Palmer shrieked, her voice becoming hysteric as the plane hit another rough patch. "A 12-year-old has no business in an airplane cockpit." From her seat behind the co-pilot, Amara felt every word like a physical blow. Too young. Too black. Too female. The same barriers her grandfather had faced, the same prejudices that had killed her mother's dreams before that storm took her life. She watched the instruments carefully, noting how co-pilot Stevens was managing the turbulence, comparing his technique to what she'd learned in countless simulator sessions. His inputs were good but conservative, safer than necessary, which was fine for passenger comfort but wouldn't work in a real emergency. "Look at her!" someone shouted from the cabin. "She's actually studying the controls. This is insane." Doubt crept into Amara's mind for the first time. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a kid playing dress-up in a world where she didn't belong. Maybe all those hours in the simulator, all of Papa Charlie's lessons, were just an old man's fantasy about his granddaughter. The turbulence worsened, and she heard passengers gasping and crying behind her. One woman was openly praying, her voice trembling with fear. These people were terrified, and they blamed her for making everything worse just by being there. "Am I really ready for this?" she wondered, her hands tightening on her grandfather's logbook. "What if they're right? What if I'm just a kid who doesn't know what she's doing?" Then she remembered Papa Charlie's words from their last training session, just 2 weeks ago. "Amara, baby, a true pilot doesn't ask permission from the storm to fly. The sky doesn't care about your age, your color, or what anybody else thinks about you being there. It only cares about whether you can handle what it throws at you." She straightened in her seat, pushing the doubt away. These passengers could mock her all they wanted, but she belonged here. Every bump and roll of the aircraft felt familiar, like a conversation she'd been having her entire life. She wasn't just some random child, she was Charles Johnson's granddaughter, Elena Johnson's daughter, and she'd earned her place in this cockpit through years of dedication and natural talent that none of these people could comprehend. The mockery continued behind her, but Amara Johnson kept her eyes on the instruments and her mind on the sky ahead. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, all their lives would depend on everything Papa Charlie had taught her. The first warning was subtle, a barely audible change in the engine's rhythm that only trained ears would catch. Amara noticed it immediately, her head tilting slightly as she listened to the familiar sound of the twin turbofans. Something was off. Captain Hayes noticed it too, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. "Tom, are you seeing anything unusual on the The aircraft shuddered violently, far worse than the earlier turbulence. This time, it wasn't nature causing the disturbance, it was the plane itself. Multiple alarms began sounding in rapid succession. The master caution light illuminated, bathing the cockpit in angry amber. Co-pilot Tom Stevens' hands flew across the controls, his training kicking in as he tried to diagnose the cascade of failures appearing on his screens. "Autopilot's disconnected," he reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Electrical issues across multiple systems. I'm showing failures in." Captain Hayes suddenly gasped, his right hand clutching his chest. His face went ashen, sweat beading on his forehead as he slumped forward in his seat. "Captain?" Stevens shouted, reaching across to support his colleague. "Sir, are you all right?" Hayes tried to speak but only managed a strangled wheeze. His breathing became labored, his lips taking on a bluish tinge that Amara recognized from her emergency medical training. Papa Charlie had insisted she learn first aid along with everything else. "It's his heart," Amara said quietly, but Stevens was too focused on the failing aircraft to hear her. The plane pitched suddenly to the left, causing screams to erupt from the passenger cabin. Without the autopilot, and with Captain Hayes incapacitated, Stevens was fighting to control an increasingly unstable aircraft, while multiple systems failed around him. Then came the sound that every passenger fears most, the mechanical thunk of oxygen masks deploying throughout the cabin. Oh God, we're all going to die!" Jessica Palmer screamed from her seat, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. The cabin erupted in panic. Passengers struggled to get their oxygen masks on while the plane continued its erratic flight path. Children were crying, adults were praying, and several people were shouting instructions at each other in the chaos. "Why are the oxygen masks down?" Margaret Ching yelled over the din. "Are we losing cabin pressure?" Co-pilot Stevens was completely overwhelmed. With one hand on the yoke trying to maintain level flight, and the other reaching for the radio to declare an emergency, he was running out of options fast. The instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights, and more systems were failing by the second. "Denver Center, Skyrise 247. He called into his headset, his voice strained. "We have multiple system failures and a medical emergency. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." But even as he spoke, another electrical surge caused the radio to crackle with static. Communication was becoming intermittent, and the primary flight displays were flickering ominously. In the chaos, nobody noticed the 12-year-old girl rising from the jump seat. Amara's mind raced through everything her mother had taught her during their secret training sessions. Elena Johnson had been obsessed with electrical failures after losing several friends to similar incidents. "The thing about electrical problems, baby," she'd said during one of their last conversations, "is they cascade. One failure leads to another, and another, until you're flying a plane with Stone Age instruments." "Tom," Amara said quietly, but the co-pilot was too focused on the controls to hear her. She looked at Captain Hayes, who was now unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Someone needed to help him, but right now someone needed to help the plane first, or medical attention wouldn't matter for any of them. "Co-pilot Stevens," she said louder, using his formal title. Stevens glanced back at her, his face etched with stress and panic. "Not now, kid. I've got. The electrical failures are cascading through the primary bus." Amara interrupted, her voice calm and clear despite the chaos around them. "You need to isolate the damaged circuits before you lose everything." Stevens stared at her for a moment, his hands still fighting the controls. "What did you say?" "Switch to emergency power on the essential bus," Amara continued, moving closer to the center console. "The backup generators can handle basic flight instruments while you troubleshoot the main system." How do you?" Stevens looked confused and desperate. Another warning light began flashing, this one indicating hydraulic pressure loss. "My mother died in a similar failure," Amara said simply. "She taught me how to handle it." The plane lurched again, and Stevens nearly lost control entirely. His training told him to ignore the child and focus on flying the aircraft, but his training hadn't prepared him for this level of system-wide failure. He was drowning in alarms and warnings, and everything he tried seemed to make things worse. "The trim tab indicator," Amara said, pointing to a specific gauge. "It's showing electrical feedback. That's what's causing the control instability." Stevens looked where she was pointing and saw she was right. The trim system was receiving conflicting electrical signals, making the aircraft fight against his control inputs. "How did you?" he started, then stopped himself. It didn't matter how she knew. What mattered was that she was right. "Disconnect the electric trim," she said calmly. "Switch to manual control and use the backup attitude indicator for reference. The primary displays are unreliable now." In the cabin behind them, passengers were screaming for help, praying out loud, and demanding to know what was happening. But in the cockpit, a 12-year-old girl was calmly diagnosing aircraft failures that were beyond the co-pilot's experience. Stevens' hands hesitated over the controls. Every instinct told him not to listen to a child, but every gauge and warning light told him he was out of his depth. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time. "Please," Amara said quietly. "Trust me." Stevens looked into her dark eyes and saw something that shouldn't have been there in a 12-year-old's face. Absolute confidence born of knowledge and training that most professional pilots never acquired. With Captain Hayes unconscious and the aircraft disintegrating around them, Tom Stevens made a decision that went against everything he thought he knew about flying. He listened to the child. "Disconnect the electric trim now," Amara said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Stevens' trembling fingers found the switch and flipped it to manual override. Immediately, the aircraft's violent bucking began to subside. "Good," she said, opening Papa Charlie's leather logbook with practiced ease. "Now we need to get down fast but controlled. The electrical failures are going to get worse before they get better." Stevens stared at her in amazement. The plane was still in serious trouble, but for the first time since the crisis began, he felt like they might have a chance. "What's your altitude?" Amara asked, scanning the backup instruments that were still functioning. 34,000 feet. Stevens replied, his voice steadier now that he had anyone, helping him think through the crisis. "We need to start an emergency descent immediately," Amara said, flipping through pages of her grandfather's handwritten notes. "But not the standard rate. Papa Charlie wrote about a similar failure in 1987, electrical cascade over the Rockies, just like this." She found the page she was looking for, her finger tracing along faded ink that documented a flight most people had forgotten. "He descended at 3,000 feet per minute, not the usual 1,000. The rapid descent helped preserve the remaining electrical systems by getting below the storm static." 3,000 feet per minute? Stevens looked uncertain. "That's awfully aggressive. The passengers are going to be a lot more uncomfortable if we lose all electrical power and have to dead stick this plane into Denver," Amara interrupted. "Trust Papa Charlie's experience. He flew this route for 30 years. Another alarm began wailing. Hydraulic pressure was dropping on the primary system. Soon they'd be fighting the controls even more. "Skyrise 247, Denver Center," crackled through the radio, barely audible through the static. "Say your intentions." Stevens keyed the microphone, but Amara gently touched his arm. "Let me," she said. "I know what they need to hear." Stevens hesitated for a moment, then handed her the radio headset. A 12-year-old talking to air traffic control was unprecedented, but nothing about this flight was following precedent. "Denver Center, Skyrise 247, Amara said, her voice professional and clear. "We have cascading electrical failures and are beginning emergency descent. We need vectors to Denver International, runway 35L if possible. It's the longest with the best approach lighting for backup instruments." There was a pause from air traffic control, clearly confused by the young voice on the radio, but the request was professional and precise. "Skyrise 247, clear direct Denver, descend and maintain flight level 240. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Copy direct Denver, descending to flight level 240. Amara replied. And Denver Center. We're going to make it. In the cabin behind them, the mood was shifting from panic to bewildered hope. The passengers could feel the plane's descent beginning, controlled and steady rather than the chaotic lurching of before. Brad Morrison, who'd been the most vocal critic, was now pressed against his window, watching the steady lights of the instruments through the cockpit door. Is that little girl actually flying the plane?" whispered Margaret Chin, her earlier hostility replaced by stunned disbelief. "She's telling the co-pilot what to do," observed Dr. Washington, his voice filled with quiet amazement. "And whatever she's saying, it's working." Amara guided Stevens through each step of the emergency checklist, but not the standard version. She was using a combination of modern procedures and her grandfather's hard-won experience from decades of flying these same routes in all kinds of weather. "Reduce power to 60%, she instructed. "The generator load will be more stable, and we'll have better control response." Stevens complied, and immediately the remaining instruments became more reliable. "Now there's going to be turbulence at 20,000 feet. Amara continued, consulting both the logbook and her mental map of Rocky Mountain weather patterns. "Papa Charlie always said this route has a wind shear layer there. Don't fight it, use it to help our descent rate, but be ready to level off quickly at 15,000 inch." As if summoned by her words, the plane hit the predicted turbulence layer. But instead of panicking, Stevens was ready for it, his hands working the controls with new confidence as Amara coached him through each bump and roll. The alarms were still blaring, the warning lights still flashing, but somehow the chaos felt manageable now. Every few seconds, Amara would quietly give Stevens another instruction, or point out a gauge reading, or explain what the next challenge would be. "Passengers are looking at you differently now," Stevens noted during a brief calm moment. Amara glanced back through the cockpit door and saw faces that had been twisted with mockery now watching her with something approaching reverence. Jessica Palmer, who'd been screaming about child endangerment, was clutching her phone but no longer recording, just staring in awe. As the plane descended through 15,000 feet, Amara caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark window beside her. For just a moment, in the subtle distortion of the glass and the flicker of instrument lights, she could swear she saw her mother's face beside her own, Captain Elena Johnson, smiling with pride. "I can feel her too," Stevens said quietly, noticing Amara's gaze. "Your mother. She's here with us." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, but her voice remained steady as she keyed the radio again. "Denver Center, Skyrise 247 is through 10,000 feet, all systems stabilizing. We're going to make this landing." Behind them, 127 passengers who had mocked a 12-year-old girl now owed their lives to her grandfather's wisdom, her mother's sacrifice, and her own unshakable courage. The worst was over. But the most important part, the landing, was still ahead. Denver International Airport appeared through the clouds like a beacon of hope, its runway lights stretching into the distance like a string of diamonds against the dark Colorado landscape. Co-pilot Stevens had his hands steady on the controls now, but it was Amara's calm voice that continued to guide them home. "Approach speed 140 knots, she said, consulting both the standard procedures and her grandfather's personal notes about landing in crosswinds at Denver. "The wind is gusting from the west, so expect a slight drift on final." Stevens nodded, completely trusting her judgment now. In the span of 30 minutes, this 12-year-old had saved not just his career, but 127 lives. He'd never doubted a pilot's instructions more at first, and never been more grateful to be proven wrong. The landing gear deployed with a reassuring thunk, and Amara felt the familiar vibration through the airframe that meant they were almost home. She glanced at Captain Hayes, who was still unconscious but breathing more steadily. The paramedics would take good care of him once they were on the ground. "Skyrise 247, you are cleared to land runway 35L, came the controller's voice through the radio. "Emergency equipment is standing by, but it looks like you won't need them." "Thank you, Denver Tower," Amara replied. "Skyrise 247 on final approach." The plane touched down with barely a bump, Stevens' landing made perfect by Amara's coaching. As the aircraft rolled down the runway, applause erupted from the passenger cabin, not the polite clapping that usually follows a routine flight, but thunderous, emotional applause from people who knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. But Amara didn't turn around to acknowledge it. She sat quietly in the jump seat, emotionally and physically drained, clutching her grandfather's logbook against her chest. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and she felt the full weight of what had just happened settling on her 12-year-old shoulders. She had saved them all. But she had also proven something to herself that she'd never been entirely sure of before. She really was ready for this. As the plane taxied to the gate, Amara could see news vans already gathering on the tarmac. Somehow, word had gotten out about the emergency landing and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. Camera crews were setting up, reporters were checking their microphones, and airport security was trying to manage the growing crowd. The passengers began filing off the plane, but instead of their usual hurried exit, many stopped at the cockpit door. Brad Morrison, the businessman who'd been most vocal in his criticism, stood there for a long moment, his face red with shame. I owe you an apology, he said quietly to Amara. All of us do. What you did up here. I've never seen anything like it. Jessica Palmer was behind him, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. The things we said? We were so wrong about you. One by one, passengers stopped to thank her, to apologize, to acknowledge that their mockery had been born of prejudice and ignorance. Margaret Chin, who'd threatened lawsuits earlier, simply placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder and said, Your parents would be so proud. Dr. Washington was the last passenger to leave, and he paused to look Amara directly in the eyes. You know what you did today wasn't just about flying, he said. You showed every person on this plane that excellence has no age, no color, no gender. You just have to be willing to do the work. As the passengers cleared the aircraft, paramedics rushed aboard to tend to Captain Hayes, who was regaining consciousness but would need immediate medical attention. The news crews were being held back by security, but Amara could hear them shouting questions through the terminal windows. Co-pilot Stevens helped Amara to her feet, his respect for her evident in every gesture. I've been flying for 15 years, he said, and I learned more from you in 30 minutes than I learned in my last recurrency training. That's when Captain Hayes, now on a stretcher but alert, beckoned Amara over to him. The reporters out there, he said weakly. They're going to want to know who you are. They're going to want the whole story. Amara nodded, understanding what he was asking. It's time, Hayes continued. Your grandfather always said this day would come, the day when Skyrise Airlines would need to meet its future. Stevens looked confused. What are you talking about? Captain Hayes smiled, despite his pain. Tom, meet Amara Johnson. Not just any Johnson, Charles Johnson's granddaughter. The legal heir to Skyrise Airlines and a pilot in training who just proved she's ready to carry on the family legacy. Stevens' jaw dropped as the realization hit him. The airline's founder. The girl who'd saved their lives wasn't just some gifted child, she was literally the future of the company they all worked for. As the paramedics wheeled Captain Hayes away, Amara stood alone in the cockpit for a moment, looking at all the switches and displays that had become as familiar to her as her own bedroom. Through the windows, she could see the crowd growing larger, reporters eager to tell the story of the 12-year-old hero who'd saved Flight 247. But this wasn't about heroism, Amara realized. This was about destiny. She walked to the captain's seat, her grandfather's seat, her mother's seat, and someday, her own seat. Gently, she placed Papa Charlie's worn leather logbook on the center console, its pages filled with decades of wisdom, experience, and love. I'm ready to fly, she whispered, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who just discovered that the sky truly was the limit. Outside, the cameras were waiting. The world was about to meet Amara Johnson, heir to Skyrise Airlines. But first, she took one last moment to feel her mother's presence beside her, her grandfather's pride surrounding her, and her own courage lifting her up like the wind beneath an aircraft's wings. She was ready to soar.